The fog should have ended the search. Instead, it began it. He saw two shapes he knew by heart vanish into the white, and when he followed, the forest gave up the one place he'd never been able to find in clear daylight. The fog had weight that morning, a woolen press that softened edges and swallowed sound until the forest felt like a room with the door half shut. David stood on the porch with a thermos and watched the clearing dissolve into white. The ridge was gone. The river a hush behind the veil. He should have waited. Weather like this hides rocks, holes, and choices you don't mean to make. But the fog carried a smell he hadn't caught in years, wet cedar and old smoke, and the tug of it leaned on a rib he'd rather keep still. He screwed the lid back on the thermos, shouldered his pack, and stepped off the porch. The path to the spring lived in his feet. He could walk it blind, and today he almost did. Snowmelt worked through the soil, the ground under the duff was slick and cool. Spider webs spanned the alder, glass-beaded, and every step brushed a new necklace of droplets onto his pants. He had been looking for the cabin for years. Not the ranger outpost, not the collapsed trapper's shack on the survey map. This one lived in stories, a caretaker's place from before the dam, tucked somewhere above the bend where the river slowed. In some versions it burned. In others it vanished when winter and time agreed. He had a photograph, sepia-greened, roofline behind leafed birch, and a scrawl on the back, south of the long rock. But the fog had come, and with it the sense that the forest was rearranging itself, paths turning a shoulder, sight lines bending, a route you'd never thought to try stepping forward like a hand. At the spring he cupped water over his face and listened. Sound traveled strangely inside the white. A jay's rasp arrived without direction, then a rabbit thumped so near he felt it in his boots. Then another sound, faint but clear in the damp, the soft creak of crusted moss under weight not his own. Two shapes slid between the trees, shadows first, their edges braided with fog. They moved with that floating steadiness he knew as well as his own handwriting. The smaller paused, head angled low, then looked back in the way he had seen 100 times at a distance and a handful up close. "All right," he said, voice swallowed. He let them set the pace. The larger skirted the wet flats, the smaller drifted right and returned. They didn't check behind them often. They didn't need to. He followed the dark seam their bodies left in the mist. Under the firs the fog thinned. Trunks rose like pilings, the floor was a braid of roots and leaf mold. Once his boot slipped and he caught himself on a cedar. The smell, sweet, resinous, carried him backward to a winter of canned peaches and a man with map hands saying there was a place above the bend if you knew the trick of seeing. They led him off his usual ground. A contour he would have cut around, they climbed straight. A deadfall he would have straddled, they passed under where the slope had lifted one end just enough. The fog made the world small, and inside that smallness the path was specific. When they slowed, he slowed. When they stopped, he did not fill the silence. At the crest the air tasted colder. The fog thickened again, closing like a door. For a moment the bears vanished, and a small, old fear rose sharp as a thorn. Then the larger shape appeared ahead, closer than he expected, the smaller tucked to her left the way a memory keeps near the thing that made it. They crossed a saddle where wind had worried the alder into hunched figures, then slipped into a shallow draw strewn with stones. Here the fog pressed low, dragging its belly along the ground. His shins brushed wet grass, his hands came away filmed when he touched a rock. The smaller bear stopped at one stone, paw resting on it, claws silent on the slick surface. The stone was long, flat, darker than the rest, basalt maybe, its skin burnished by years under water. South of the long rock, the scrawl had said. He stood beside it and looked into the fog. No cabin yet. But the air had that other smell, wet wood and cold ash, and under it something faintly metallic, like old nails closed in a fist. When they moved again, they took a line he didn't know. The draw tightened, then spilled onto a bench of young birch so pale their trunks looked like bones. Beyond them ground lifted and folded out of sight. The fog pooled there. The larger stopped at the edge of that brightness and waited. The smaller went forward 2 steps, looked back, then vanished into the white as if a door had shut. David's fingers found the photograph in his pocket, the paper soft at the corners from opening and closing. He didn't look at it. He held it folded in his fist and stepped after them, feeling the ground with his boot toes before shifting weight, letting the white swallow and then give back each measure of distance. Old buildings make a sound in wet weather, wood swollen in joints, a held breath in beams, a faint sigh where a roof meets air. He heard it before he saw it. Then the fog wavered, thinned, and the shape found him. The cabin rose from the birch like a held story returning to the mouth that first told it. Roof low, door off-center, one window boarded from inside. The porch had surrendered to the ground. A rusted stovepipe leaned like it was listening. The bears stood to one side, not close, not far. The larger watched the trees. The smaller looked between David and the door. He felt the ache when a search meets its end, relief braided with a hollowing. Then he climbed the 2 tilted steps, set his hand to the latch, and slowly pushed it open. The door moved with a groan that seemed to rise from the bones of the building itself. Damp wood resisted in places, then yielded in a long, low sigh. Cold air breathed out to meet him, a mix of earth, wet ash, and the faint sweetness of something long stored in cedar. The fog clung to the doorway for a moment, then slid past him, curling along the floor before thinning into the corners. The inside was dim but not blind. Light bled through gaps in the walls and around the window boards in thin silver threads. Dust hung in the air like held snow, drifting when he moved. The floorboards were warped but solid, edges cupped upward from seasons of swelling and drying. On the left, a narrow table slouched against the wall, its top covered in a scatter of objects that seemed arranged by neither order nor accident, a coil of wire, 2 small glass jars with cloudy contents, a folded scrap of oiled cloth, a tin mug dented at the rim. On the right, a low bunk sat beneath the boarded window, its mattress long gone, replaced by a bedding of dry cedar boughs, newer than the rest of the room. Someone, something, had slept here recently. The air was thick with the smell of those boughs. Under it, a cooler scent tugged at him, rust and old paper. He crossed the room, boots whispering on the boards, and crouched by the bunk. Against the far wall, partly hidden by the cedar, was a wooden box. The lid had shrunk away from its hinges. He lifted it. Inside lay a stack of notebooks, their covers darkened by moisture at the edges. The top one was tied with twine. He set it on the bunk and untied it carefully, the knot crumbling into fibers under his fingers. The handwriting inside was small, neat, and pressed into the paper as if the writer had been cold. The first page held a date he couldn't place against the calendar, winter of a year before the dam, perhaps. The words spoke of a caretaker's days, checking traps, mending fences, logging weather. Then, without warning, an entry that stopped him. Saw them again at Ridge. Smaller than before. Still 2. He turned the page. The entries shifted between lists and moments, clearing snow from the spring, the sound of a bear coughing in the dark, the quiet after. It was all written without claim, without ownership, as if the writer understood the forest as a place shared. He closed the notebook and looked toward the open door. Through the fog he could see them, still there, one sitting back on her haunches, the other standing angled toward the slope, watching something beyond his sight. He went to the table. The coil of wire was finer than he'd thought, not fence wire, but snare wire, untwisted and left open, as if abandoned mid-work. Beneath the oiled cloth was a small photograph, its edges curled. It showed the cabin in sharper days, roof whole, boards tight, smoke rising from the stovepipe. In the doorway, a man stood in a wool jacket, a notebook in his hand, head turned towards something outside the frame. His face was in shadow. David set the photo back exactly where it had been. He tried the door to the right of the bunk. The hinges resisted, but a push opened it into a narrow side room. Here the smell was stronger, metal and damp. Shelves lined one wall, holding tins with no labels, a lantern without a chimney, and a small tin box with a latch. When he opened it, he found a set of rusted keys, each marked with a tag scratched by hand. One tag read simply, "Hatch." He scanned the floor. Near the far wall, a square of planks sat slightly proud of the rest. He crouched, set the box aside, and pressed at one corner. The plank lifted, revealing a dark space beneath, the smell of earth rising up sharp and old. He angled his head but couldn't see far, only the suggestion of a tunnel or pit, the air down there colder, carrying the faintest trace of water. Something moved outside, a soft crunch of weight on damp ground. He straightened and crossed to the door. The smaller bear had moved closer to the porch. His fur was darkened by moisture, ears pricked toward the cabin as if listening. The larger was still near the birch edge, head turning slowly toward the river bend below. David stepped onto the porch. The fog was shifting, thinner now, revealing more of the clearing and the slope beyond. He followed their gaze and saw what lay at the edge of sight, the long rock, half exposed in the thaw, water beating along its spine. He looked back at the cabin. The air inside felt like it was holding something, not just the caretaker's story, but a choice. The hatch was still open in the side room. The notebooks waited on the bunk. The smaller bear made a low sound, a rumble more felt than heard, then turned toward the slope. Without looking back, he started walking into the fog again. The larger followed. David hesitated, one hand on the doorframe, the damp grain under his palm. He knew they were leading him somewhere else. He also knew the cabin wasn't finished with him. He closed the door gently, the sound settling into the fog like a held breath, then stepped off the porch to follow. The smaller bear's tracks pressed deep into the damp earth, each print carrying a perfect rim of fog beads that clung until he stepped close enough to scatter them. David walked just far enough behind to avoid breaking their rhythm, his boots landing where the ground was firm. The larger bear moved with a steadiness that made the fog seem to shape itself around her. They led him down the slope in a long, gradual descent, the trees shifting from tight fir to a looser weave of cedar and alder. The air here was heavier, laced with the constant breath of water. Somewhere ahead, the river bent. When the fog opened for a moment, he saw the long rock clearly for the first time from this angle. It wasn't just a slab. It stretched like a low wall across the bank, worn smooth on the upstream side, undercut slightly on the other where the current curled back on itself. Moss clung to the top in a wavering green stripe, and beads of water slid off into the river with the slow certainty of time. The smaller bear reached the rock first, stepping onto it as if it were a familiar crossing. The larger stopped at the bank, watching the waters curl. David stood a few paces back, the damp smell of the river filling his chest. The rock was slick, one wrong step and you'd be in the slow turn of the bend, pulled under the lip where water darkened. The smaller bear didn't cross. He walked halfway, then stopped, nose low, sniffing at a point where the moss thinned. He pawed once, peeling a strip away to reveal dark stone beneath. It was not random, the scrape revealed a shallow groove, worn deep enough to be intentional. Another mark followed it, running parallel, faint but certain. David stepped forward. The rock was colder than the air, its surface slick enough to make him plant his feet carefully. Kneeling where the moss had been scraped, he traced the groove with his fingers. The edges were softened by time, but the depth and precision said it wasn't just erosion. It was a marker. Or a key. The larger bear rumbled low, the sound resonating in his chest. David looked up to see her gaze fixed downstream. The fog thickened there, swirling like smoke over the bend, hiding what lay beyond. He followed their lead again, stepping off the rock on the downstream side. The bank here was narrow, choked with driftwood bleached by years of sun and flood. They picked their way through it, the bears silent, their paws barely disturbing the silt. The bend tightened, and the river's voice deepened into a steady, hollow note. The fog shifted again, revealing a structure on the far bank, low, dark, nearly consumed by brush. It might have been just another deadfall tangle, except for the faint angle of cut wood and a flash of iron where the mist thinned. The smaller bear paused at the water's edge, nose twitching. The larger turned and looked directly at David, holding his gaze in a way that felt like a hand on the shoulder. Then she stepped into the shallows. The water swirled around her legs, current tugging, but she moved with careful weight, choosing each step as if she knew the bottom's map. The smaller followed, and together they reached the far bank, shaking water from their fur in heavy drops that disappeared into the fog. David hesitated. The crossing wasn't wide, but the current was steady and the rocks unseen. Still, he knew if he lost them here, he wouldn't find this place again, not in fog like this. He stepped in. The cold seized his boots instantly, filling them with the ache of river melt. He found his footing by feel, sliding each foot until it lodged against something solid before shifting weight. Halfway across, the current pushed harder, making his pack shift. He bent his knees, keeping low, until the far bank rose under his boots and the cold loosened its grip. The bears waited just beyond the brush. The structure ahead took shape as they moved, not a cabin exactly, but an outbuilding of some kind. Its roof sagged in the center, but the walls still held. A chain hung from a corner post, rusted and half buried in moss. The door was gone, replaced by a lattice of branches and leaves woven tight enough to block the interior from view. The smaller bear padded to the opening and began pawing at the lower branches. The larger stood back, watching him work. David stepped closer, the smell of damp wood and metal stronger now, tinged with something older, almost mineral. When the last branch dropped, the view inside made him stop. It was a root cellar, or had been once. The floor dropped a few steps down, where stone walls sweated in the cold. Along one side, wooden shelves leaned but still held their cargo, jars cloudy with age, their contents dark shapes suspended in pale syrup. A wooden crate sat in the corner, lid askew, revealing glass bottles with their necks sealed in wax. And against the far wall, under a strip of rotting canvas, was a long wooden chest. The smaller bear stepped down into the cellar, sniffing at the chest's edge. He looked back at David once, then pawed at the lid. David's hands felt suddenly heavy. The chest was dry where the canvas had covered it, its surface dusted with fine dirt but still sound. The lock plate was iron, flaked with rust, but the shape was whole, a simple keyhole. He thought of the tin box in the cabin. The key tagged hatch. He looked up at the bears. The larger had turned toward the fog again, as if listening for something upstream. The smaller stayed close to the chest, eyes half on David, half on the thing itself. The current beyond the bank spoke in its deep bend voice. The fog shifted, and for a breath the far ridge was visible, ghost pale above the trees, before the white closed in again. David rested a hand on the chest, feeling the grain under his palm. The wood was cool, but not lifeless. Whatever it held had waited a long time. And now, it seemed, it had been found. He didn't open the chest that hour. The knowledge felt like a live wire in his hand. He needed the right insulation. Keys, the tin box, the tag that said hatch. Shapes lined up as cleanly as grooves on the long rock. He smoothed the canvas over the lid and stood, taking a new imprint of the place, the hush of the bend, the cool exhale from stone, the bear's breath threading the white. The smaller waited at the cellar mouth, the larger had stepped to the bank, watching the river with that slow side-to-side scan that meant she was counting more than water. When David climbed the steps, the smaller rose too and brushed the opening with his shoulder, then turned with quiet certainty. They recrossed at the shallows where the bottom was a basket of stones. The current pressed at his shins, tugged at his pack, then let him go. On the near shore the fog thinned, light found the birch in soft plains. The bears took the draw in a long diagonal, retracing seams they had stitched into the morning. At the long rock the smaller set a paw where moss had been peeled. It looked simple now, groove, south of. The scrawl on the photograph's back was a compass you needed fog to read. When they reached the cabin clearing, the white lay shallower. The door took his hand without argument. Inside, the room felt held. The notebooks sat where he'd left them, a lifted page had curled as it dried, like a finger asking for attention. He coaxed the lantern alight. He fetched the tin box from the side room and tipped the keys into his palm. Iron bloomed into dark flowers, each tagged in a pressed, tidy hand. Gate. Winch. Loft. Hatch. He chose hatch. At the raised square he slid the plank. Cold air lifted from the dark, tasting of earth and iron. He angled the lantern and found a plate set into the near wall, flush with the boards, iron, with a keyhole the twin of the chests. A lock not for a lid but a door into ground. The key turned with a pained click and a long, tired sigh. He shouldered the panel. It swung inward. A narrow passage fell away at a low angle, shored with rough planks. Water ticked somewhere in the seam of the hill. He went down 20 steps, maybe 30. The ceiling brushed his shoulder. The tunnel flared into a pocket room the size of the side room above. A table stood there, bare save for 2 rings, wax and dust. On the far wall a slot opened into black, carrying a ribbon of chill that smelled like river. He felt the floor. Parallel scratches ran across the boards, the kind crates leave when slid for years. In the corner crouched a little iron winch. Function, not story, announced itself. The cabin was a lid, the tunnel a throat. Somewhere below and downriver the cellar mouth waited like a hand. He climbed back. In the side room he closed the panel and set the key atop the box. Outside, the doorway was a square of pale wool. He opened a notebook near the damp-warped middle. An entry, pressed hard by a cold hand, Ben cells intact. Moved jars. Left chest, too heavy for one. Frost in hatch, grease when thaw. Another line, fog makes the way plain. Long rock marks the pull south. He closed the book. The bears were where he'd left them, smaller near the porch, larger watching the slope like a weather vane. The fog would not hold forever. He pocketed the key and paused on the threshold. "One more time," he said, to them or the place or the hand that had written about fog, and stepped into the white. They turned as if he had answered a question asked by standing still. Down the draw, across the long rock, through the driftwood teeth of the bend. The river held its note. The key knocked his thigh with each step. At the outbuilding the woven branches lay where they had fallen. The cellar exhaled cool, held air. He set the lantern on the top step and crossed to the chest. The iron mouth was the hatch's twin. He slid the key home. Iron spoke to iron with the intimate rasp of old neighbors. The lid lifted a hair and stuck. He wedged fingers under and raised it slow. The canvas had kept the worst out, the chest rose with the reluctant honesty of old wood. Inside lay order made by hands that believed in winter. Paper-wrapped bundles, tied with twine and marked in pencil. A canvas roll of tools, auger, awl, small hammer. A tin of grease. A coil of finer chain. In a smaller box nested within lay vials corked and waxed, labels cramped and neat, river iron, black sand, mica scrap. Another bundle held maps, onion skin, edges curled, inked lines tracing the river's splice and the ridge's bones. On one, a dot for the cabin, another at the bend, ellipses where the P. At the bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a notebook heavier than the rest. He untied it. The first page held a name he didn't know and a sentence that stepped across the decades. "Leave a thread in the fog. Someone will need it." He looked up. The lantern made an island in the cellar. At its edge, the bears waited in their patient geometry, one at the threshold, one higher by the bank, holding the shape of a door. He slid the notebook into his pack, set the maps atop it, and closed the chest. The key came away cleanly. He pocketed it, lifted the lantern, and felt the fog lean close like a listener. "All right," he said again, a word that meant yes and now and I hear you. They led him back toward the cabin he had already found, and toward whatever it had been built to connect. The fog held, though the light inside it had changed, not brighter, but looser, like a knot starting to give. David could feel the days shift in the way shadows moved at the edge of sight, the way sounds from the river carried farther before dissolving. He knew this was the moment to choose, take the maps back to warmth, or follow them now, before the forest rearranged itself again. The bears gave him no instruction. The smaller waited at the bank, eyes steady, while the larger had already turned upriver. She moved without pause, her path tracing the thin strip of gravel between water and alder. David slung his pack higher, checked the lantern's oil, and followed. The map from the chest was drawn in lines as thin as hairs, the river's bends rendered with a precision only years of walking could give. There were marks he didn't understand, a series of short crosshatches along the bank, a circle at a narrow point, and further up, a symbol that looked like a small sun, half-shaded. The gravel narrowed, forcing them into the trees where roots knuckled up through soil black with moisture. His boots sank and held, each lift came with a slow sound of suction. In places, the fog thinned just enough to show the current's skin, dark, restless, flecked with stray foam. After a half hour, the larger stopped. She stood at the base of a cedar that rose straight for 50 feet before its first branch, its trunk banded with scars where bark had been stripped in long verticals. At its base, the ground rose in a small mound of stones, each one worn round by water and laid with deliberate care. David crouched. Beneath a layer of moss, the stones formed a circle, broken only on the side facing the river. In the center sat a single iron spike, driven flush into the earth, its head bent slightly toward the current. He touched it, cold, unmoving. The smaller bear came up beside him, sniffed the air, then lifted his muzzle to the cedar's height. David followed the line of his gaze. Above the lowest branch, a narrow crossbar of wood jutted from the trunk, lashed in place with what looked like old fishing line. A small bundle hung there, something wrapped in oilskin, no bigger than a loaf of bread. A signal. Or a cache. The map's sun symbol had been placed almost exactly here. He unshouldered his pack, pulled out the coil of chain from the chest, and tested its weight in his hand. The tree was climbable, but the wet bark would take skin with it if he slipped. He tucked the chain back and instead searched the ground for a fallen branch long enough to hook the bundle. The larger bear shifted, stepping toward the mound of stones, then stopped. She looked at him over her shoulder, not impatient, not warning, just waiting for the choice to be made. David found a branch, stripped the twigs, and tested the hook he'd cut into one end with his knife. It took 3 tries before he caught the oilskin and worked it free from the crossbar. It fell into his hands with a weight that surprised him, denser than cloth, with a core that shifted slightly when he turned it. He knelt on the stones to open it. The oilskin had been folded with a precision that made it resistant to clumsy hands. Inside was a cylinder of copper, capped at both ends with threaded brass. Verdigris had crept over the seams, but the caps turned after a moment's stubbornness. Inside the cylinder was a single sheet of parchment rolled tight. He coaxed it out slowly, afraid of tearing. When he spread it on his knee, he saw another map, smaller in scope, but far older. The river was there, but its bends were different, as if this had been drawn before the dam altered its path. At the center of the sheet was a mark he recognized from the caretaker's notebook, 2 small shapes side by side, not circles, but rough ovals, pointed at one end. Bears. Below them, in a cramped, almost hidden script, follow in fog, not in sun. The larger bear made a low sound, deep and short, then turned upriver again. The smaller followed, brushing David's shoulder as he passed. He folded the parchment carefully, slid it back into the cylinder, and tucked the whole into his pack. His fingers brushed the older notebook, the maps, the coil of chain. He understood now that none of these things were meant to be found by daylight wanderers. The fog was the curtain. The bears were the pole. The upriver path was narrower, the bank crumbling in places where high water had undercut it. Fallen trees bridged the gaps, slick with algae and fog beads. He crossed them slowly, the bears pausing at each end until he stepped down safely. Eventually they reached a narrow pinch where the river split around a small, wooded island. The current on the near side was sluggish, but the far channel ran fast, white water blooming where boulders broke the flow. On the map, this place was marked by a crescent, the point facing the sun symbol. Beyond it, somewhere in the thicker white, lay whatever the caretaker had meant him to find. The larger bear moved to the water's edge and looked back at him. Her fur was dark with damp, eyes steady, the weight of years behind them. The smaller stood just upstream, where the water's lip broke in small waves. David tightened his pack straps, set his boots firm in the gravel, and stepped forward. The fog thickened again, rolling off the water in slow billows, as if the river itself was breathing him toward the next mark. The split in the river sounded different on each side. To his left, the near channel moved with a sluggish swirl, its surface broken only by drifting leaves and the occasional swirl of something unseen beneath. To his right, the far channel churned in restless white, its voice louder, sharper, The kind of water that didn't negotiate if you missed your footing. The island between was a wedge of alder and moss, its banks undercut in places where the water had bitten deep. From where David stood, it looked too far for a simple wade, but not wide enough to make a boat necessary. The current's patterns, though, could turn that calculation wrong in an instant. The larger bear stepped into the near channel, moving slowly at first, then with steady confidence as the water rose to her chest. She aimed for the upper tip of the island, using the slower current as an ally. The smaller bear followed in her exact track, his head turning now and then toward David as if to be sure he was coming. David took one last look at the map in his head, the crescent mark, the bear symbols beyond. He slung the lantern higher on his pack straps and stepped into the water. The cold was immediate, clamping his calves and thighs. The gravel underfoot shifted, some stones rolling, others lodged tight. He copied the larger bear's pace, leaning into the flow. The water's grip strengthened halfway across, tugging at his knees. He shifted each foot forward only when he'd locked the last one firm. When he reached the island's bank, the larger bear was already climbing onto a shelf of damp moss. She shook herself once, sending a mist of water into the fog. The smaller bear waited for him to step onto the same shelf before padding into the island's interior. The air here was different, quieter, as if the split currents had left a space where sound could collect and stay. The ground was spongy, stitched with old roots that coiled underfoot. Ferns reached chest-high in places, their fronds heavy with dew. In the fog, the alder trunks looked like gray spears planted at random angles. The smaller bear led them on a winding path, his nose low, moving between the thickest ferns. David kept track of direction by habit, though the fog tried to erode his sense of distance. They weren't heading straight across. Instead, they curved toward the island's center. They came to a clearing no larger than a room. In the middle, half swallowed by moss and roots, stood the remains of a wooden structure. Its walls had collapsed inward, but its foundation was still a tight rectangle of stone. The air around it was colder, carrying a faint metallic tang, like rust or wet iron. David knelt at the edge, brushing moss away from one of the corner stones. The rock was cut clean, its edges still sharp despite the years. On its inner face, shallow carvings ran in a straight line, small triangles alternating with short vertical lines. He traced them with his fingers, the stone cold enough to leach heat from his skin. The larger bear circled the clearing, pausing at a gap in the foundation where two stones had shifted apart. She lowered her head and sniffed the space, then stepped back as if to leave it for him. David leaned in. Beneath the gap was a narrow cavity, just wide enough for an arm. Inside, he felt not soil, but wood, the edge of a board fitted flush against stone. He slid his fingers along it until they found a notch. He pulled. The board came free with a dry scrape. Behind it was a space, and in that space, wrapped in thick oiled canvas, lay a long, narrow object. It was lighter than he expected when he drew it out, the weight shifting slightly as if something inside moved. He unwrapped the canvas on the moss. Inside was a carved wooden case, its surface worn smooth in places by handling. The lid was fitted with a simple sliding latch. He pushed it aside. Inside lay a telescope, brass-bodied, the kind that collapsed into itself for storage. Its metal was dulled but unpitted, its lenses capped with leather. Beneath it, set into the case's lining, was another parchment roll, smaller than the copper cylinders but sealed with the same wax stamp, a circle bisected by two small ovals. He broke the wax and unrolled it. This map showed only the island and the channels around it, and on the far side, past the faster current, a single mark, a black square. He looked at the bears. The larger stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the river beyond the trees. The smaller sat back on his haunches, his eyes fixed on the telescope. David slid the map into his pack and lifted the telescope from its case. The brass was cold against his hands. He extended it, the joints moving with the slow resistance of long-dormant machinery. Through the lens, the fog became a softer field, shapes within it resolving just enough to hint at their true edges. He swept it across the far channel. The current blurred into streaks of white and dark, but beyond it, through a break in the alder, he caught a shadow, a straight line that did not belong to trees or rock. A wall. He collapsed the telescope, rewrapped it in the canvas, and slid it into his pack. The black square on the map was waiting beyond that wall. Whatever this place had been, cabin, chest, tunnel, island, it was all a thread leading there. The larger bear moved toward the far bank without hesitation. The smaller followed. David checked the straps on his pack, cinched them tight, and stepped after them. The far channel spoke louder the closer they came to it, not the even, endless voice of a wide river, but a constant, shifting argument. Rocks hidden beneath its surface broke the current into snarls, the water surged, recoiled, and flung itself forward again. The fog above it swirled in uneasy spirals, torn by gusts that carried the cold straight into David's jacket. The larger bear stepped to the edge first. She stood where the bank sloped in a narrow spit of gravel, her paws already wet from the reach of the waves. The smaller paced behind her, nose high, catching scents the wind shoved ahead of the current. David studied the span, not more than 20 feet across at its narrowest, but fast enough that a misplaced step could drag you downriver before you could turn to face it. He set his pack down and crouched, picking a line in his head. The black square on the map was somewhere just beyond the far bank, hidden behind the alder screen. The telescope's shadow of a wall was confirmation enough, but crossing in water like this was a choice you got right once. The larger bear didn't wait for a plan. She stepped in, angling upstream so the current pushed against her flank. Her paws found invisible footing under the churn, each placement slow but sure. David saw her shoulders roll with the strength it took to resist the push. The smaller bear followed close, tucking into her wake, letting her body split the worst of the current. David slung his pack high, securing the lantern against his chest. He stepped in where the larger bear had gone, his boots vanishing into the foam almost instantly. The cold was a physical blow, locking his muscles for a heartbeat before instinct forced them to move. He aimed his body into the current, leaning so far he could feel the pull in his hips. Every step was a search, slide the foot forward, press down, test for rock or branch, shift weight only when the footing was sure. Midway, the channel deepened. The water surged against his waist, the push so strong he had to widen his stance just to hold his ground. He saw the smaller bear slip, only a fraction, and the larger swung her head to steady him with her shoulder. David caught the same boil of current a moment later. His foot found no purchase, and his body turned half sideways before he could wrench it back into line. He moved faster after that, not from panic, but because staying in the current too long would sap his legs before the far bank. When his boots scraped gravel again, he surged forward and planted himself on the bank, breath coming hard in clouds. The larger bear shook water in a spray that caught the dim light, beads vanishing into the fog. The smaller stepped up beside David, nose already pointing toward the alder screen. Beyond it, something blocked the wind, the current's voice dulled here, and the fog pooled thicker. They moved into the trees, following a narrow path pressed into the damp earth. It curved only slightly before stopping dead at a wall. Up close, David could see it wasn't stone or wood, but both, a base of fitted blocks rising to meet a framework of thick timbers, the spaces between filled with slabs of slate. Moss and lichen patterned it in a patchwork of dark green and pale gray. In the center was a door. It was smaller than he expected, barely shoulder width, with iron straps running across it in a diagonal brace. A single handle protruded, rusted but intact. No lock was visible, but above the handle, someone had carved two small ovals side by side, the same mark from the maps. The larger bear stopped just short of the threshold. The smaller moved closer, sniffed the wood, then stepped back, his gaze turning toward David as if the rest was up to him. He reached out and touched the handle. The cold bit through his glove. When he pulled, the door resisted, not from rust, but from weight, as though something leaned against it from inside. He tried again, shifting his stance, and the hinges groaned. The gap widened enough for a breath of air to slip out, heavy with the scent of stone, old rope, and something metallic. The fog pressed close behind him, making the light shallow. He swung the door open far enough to step through. The space beyond was a courtyard no larger than a single room, enclosed on three sides by the same stone and timber wall. The fourth side was a sheer drop to the river below, its water a dark blur through the mist. Against one wall stood a structure, part shed, part shelter, its roof sagging but its shape still holding. Ropes hung from hooks inside, their coils stiff with age. In one corner, a winch was bolted to the wall, its crank frozen mid-turn. David stepped inside, the boards creaking under his boots. The winch cable ran out through a gap in the wall, disappearing into the fog toward the river. A narrow ladder led upward to a small platform, a lookout if the position was right. He climbed. The ladder groaned, but held. At the top, he found himself standing above the fog's main layer. The river below was a shifting canvas of gray and white, the island just visible as a darker smear upstream. Beyond that, the forest was a quilt of muted color, its edges erased by distance. But it was what lay directly beneath the platform that caught his attention, a narrow channel cut into the cliff face, just wide enough for a small boat. The current here slowed as if respecting the space. If the winch cable reached that far, it could raise or lower something, or someone, from this height to the water. He turned back toward the door, where the bears still stood. The larger had taken a seat, her eyes fixed on him. The smaller was still at the threshold, head tilted slightly, as though waiting for him to decide what came next. Up on the platform, the wind skimmed the fog thin enough that the river's white seams showed through like threads pulled from cloth. David crouched by the winch. The iron smelled of wet pennies and old rope. A pawl held the drum in place, the teeth were packed with a paste of rust and grit. He thumbed the brake lever. It refused. He remembered the tin of grease in his pack from the chest. He climbed down, slipped the strap, and fished it out. The lid came free with a tacky pop. He worked grease into the pawl pivot, the spindle ends, the ratchet face, patiently wiping away the red mud with a strip of canvas. When he eased the pawl back and put his weight to the handle, the drum moved a fraction. Somewhere below, hidden by fog and stone, wood-knocked wood, hollow, near. The larger bear lifted her head at the sound, eyes on the gap where the cable disappeared. The smaller shifted to the threshold, his paws planted like chalks. David set the lantern on a hook in the shed where its light made a low sun. He tested the brake again, held, and then he began to crank. The cable answered in a low hum that thrummed into the wall. Every turn brought the handle up slow, then down against the drag of weight rising out of water. The drum's voice changed as the load climbed, first a wet thudding, then the scrape of wood on stone, then the steady rasp of something guided in a close channel. He paused to listen. The current below knocked at the cliff as if impatient. He cranked on. Breath fogged the air between his teeth. The grease warmed into its work, the pawl clicked with a clean rhythm. The weight eased, then grew again, an upstep in the slope below, maybe a ledge or the mouth of the cut. "Come on," he said under his breath, not to the winch exactly, but to the system of it, the hidden carpentry, the man who had bolted iron to wall and set rollers where rock would have chewed wood to splinters. The first edge appeared, a wet bow nosing from the fog, paint long gone, planks sprung but serviceable. Not a boat built to travel, he realized, but a flat skiff built to fit the slot, sides squared, runners sheathed in iron. A bracket on the bow matched his lantern's base as if it expected light to live there. Behind the bow rose the load, a long crate strapped with hemp and iron dogs, water streaming from its seams. The crate bore a burned-in mark, two small ovals side by side inside a ring. The caretaker's sign. He dropped the pawl into the teeth and let the drum hold. The skiff settled against the platform lip, its runners kissing the iron wearplate with a tired sigh. David set the brake, tested it with a shove, then leaned out, catching the bow line with a gloved hand. He used his coil of chain to secure the stern ring to a walleye. The system felt awake again, creaks answering pulls, the whole of it ready to work if asked. Up close, the crate's iron bands had swollen with rust. One dog had split, the hemp had been relashed with a newer splice and tarred to by years. He touched the tar, still pliant under the skin. Someone had kept this alive long after maps faded. A draft slipped through the wall, cold, dry, familiar. He turned. A narrow slot, waist-high, cut into the masonry behind the shed, breathed river-cool air into the courtyard. He crouched and held his palm there. The little wind ran past his skin the way it had in the tunnel below the cabin. Not a coincidence. A mouth here, a throat there. The line between them was the fog itself. He set the lantern into the bow bracket. Its light reached down the channel like a wick, finding water and wheel-slick stone. He checked the crate's lashings for rot, then found, at the forward end, a smaller box bolted to the deck. It bore the same mark as the crate. The lid was pinned, not locked. Inside lay spare pawl springs, a small wrench ground thin, a leather strap, and, wrapped in oilcloth, a copper cylinder twin to the one from the cedar cache. He worked its cap loose. The parchment inside was short, and less a map than a set of instructions, written in the careful hand he had met in the notebooks. Winch only under white. Lantern forward. Brake when the second roller hums, listen. Do not haul into sun. Anchor skiff with chain before opening. Beneath, a line, if the river is high, send it back. The throat won't take weight. Trust the bears to tell you. He looked over his shoulder. The larger had begun that slow side-to-side scan again, listening with her whole body. The smaller remained at the sill, calm as a carved thing, but his ears picked at the current's changes. David set the cylinder on a shelf and ran his hand along the crate's top edge. A slot there suggested a sliding panel, a way to open without prying bands. He lifted. It moved an inch and stuck. He eased it back, thinking of the instruction, anchor before opening, and checked his chain again. Solid. He drew the panel farther. A breath of cold lifted, edged with tannin and a faint metallic sweetness. Inside lay rows of packages wrapped in waxed cloth and labeled in that same tidy script: salt pork, autumn, flour, dry, lamp oil, 2 shot, mixed. Beneath those, a rack built for bottles. Their crowns were waxed, necks resting in felt. Each bore a date and a short note: for fog, for winter, for those who keep the way. Not contraband. Not treasure. Provisions for a post meant to work when eyes couldn't see it. The winch hauled Need, up through secrecy, into service. He slid the panel shut. The river below shifted its note a half-tone lower, as if a hand had pressed on a string. The larger bear's head came up. She rumbled once, a quiet thunder under the bones of the place. Noted, he said, and felt the word click into the old instructions like a pole tooth. High water. Not today for hauling the weight farther inland. He would not run the throat until the white let him. What mattered now was knowing. The system was whole: cabin, hatch and tunnel, river cellar at the bend, island cache with glass and lens, winch, skiff, crate, wall, door. The fog was not just weather here. It was policy. He set the pawl deep. He loosened the chain just enough that the skiff could travel if he sent it back. The brake lever lifted under his palm with the reluctance of a creature waking. He cranked in reverse, easing cable and watching the drum's teeth count the descent. The skiff slid out of the light into its groove. Water took the weight with a low, relieved knock. He stopped at the second roller's hum. There it was, a change in pitch that matched the script. He set the brake. The lantern burned in the bracket like a star not meant for night eyes. On the platform, the air smelled cleaner, as if the system's breath had cleared. He took the copper cylinder, the telescope, the maps, and the notebook with the first instruction to leave a thread. He coiled the chain, wiped his hands, and turned toward the door. The bears had not moved far. They stood in the fog with the kind of patience that makes a place feel older than it is. The smaller looked at the lantern and then at David, as if to ask whether he would leave it to mark the way. He nodded and left it. He pulled the door until iron-kissed jam and the courtyard sounds folded back into stone. The river's argument returned to its usual distance. Fog pressed its forehead to the threshold. "All right," he said, and the word felt like a hinge closing. They led him out the way they had brought him in, past alder spears and wet roots, the white thickening again as if to keep the secret. Behind them, the lantern burned in the skiff's bow where only fog and river would see. By the time they left the wall and crossed the alder screen, the fog had changed. It no longer pressed in thick and uniform. Instead, it broke into ribbons that drifted low across the ground, leaving pockets of clearer air between. In those pockets, the forest's colors returned in muted patches: the deep green of moss, the black gloss of wet bark, the brown-red underbelly of fallen cedar. David felt it first as light, not much, but enough to tell that somewhere above, the sky had begun to thin. It was the kind of change you could miss if you didn't know the white's moods. But the bears knew. The larger shifted her pace, choosing routes that stayed in the heavier ribbons. The smaller would stop now and then, as if listening for a cue from the fog itself before moving on. The far channel, once a roar muffled by mist, sounded sharper now. When they reached its bank, David saw more of its face, the white seam over rock, the slate-green depths in between. The crossing would be brighter this time, easier in some ways, harder in others. Without the fog's cover, you felt the space between banks more. The larger bear stepped in first, planting her paws in the same upstream angle as before. The smaller followed close. David adjusted his pack straps, double-checked the cylinder and telescope inside, then stepped into the current. The cold shocked the breath from him, but the footing was surer now. The light made the submerged stones visible, though the distortion of the water turned their shapes into shifting lenses. He followed the path he'd memorized, each step measured against the push of the flow. The bears moved ahead, water breaking around their shoulders in bright arcs. When they reached the gravel of the island, he stood for a moment, letting the current's weight drain from his legs. The air here was still heavy with moisture, but the fog was loosening its hold. He could see across the island to where the slow channel curled past its mossy bank. The smaller bear moved toward the island's center, then stopped and looked back at him. David followed, boots sinking in the spongy ground. The clearing where the stone foundation sat looked almost different now, more a ruin in a meadow than a shadow in a mist. The moss was brighter, the ferns taller. The carved symbols on the cornerstone caught a flash of pale light from above. He crouched there again, running his fingers over the grooves. He had the telescope, the cylinder, the memory of the crate. But the black square on the island's map had been the wall he had now seen, touched, opened. The connection between all the pieces was more than geography. It was a system of trust, set in place by hands long gone, left for someone to follow if they had the sense and the patience to read it. He checked the pack again. Inside, the telescope wrapped in the oiled canvas. The smaller map from the island cache. The copper cylinder from the skiff's deck, its instructions dry and safe. The notebook from the cedar chest with the matching script. The original glass lenses from the river cellar. Each item was proof of a link in the chain. But not all chains were meant to be taken apart. He left the wooden case where it had been, recovered with moss. The skiff was anchored. The lantern burned. The fog still held over the wall. He looked up. The sky above the island was a lighter shade of gray now, the fog thinning enough to show the pale disk of the sun. The weather would shift soon, and when it did, the white might not return for days. The larger bear moved toward the slow channel. The smaller waited for him. David stepped into the water again, grateful for its gentler pace. The surface barely kissed his knees, and the bottom was solid gravel. On the far bank, he paused to look back. The island sat low in the river, half shrouded in what was left of the fog. From this angle, you could almost miss it, the alder blending with the mainland trees. Only the faintest change in the water's tone gave it away. They climbed the slope to the main trail. The fog had thinned here, too, but in patches where it still clung, the world felt the same as it had hours before, muffled, private, hidden. In those moments, David knew that if he had to, he could find the way again. The path wasn't marked by signs. It was marked by the feel of the air, the pitch of the river, the way the white behaved around the trees. By the time they reached the higher ground where the ridge began, the fog had retreated into the valleys. The bears moved easily now, no longer keeping to its cover. The smaller ranged ahead, the larger holding a steady pace at David's flank. The cabin, the one he'd started from that morning, showed through the thinning mist like a ghost deciding to return to form. Smoke from the banked hearth still trailed from the chimney. The air smelled faintly of cedar and ash. He stopped short of the clearing, turning to watch the bears. The larger stopped when he did. The smaller circled once, then came to stand beside her. Neither moved to leave. Instead, they simply watched him as they had on that first day, not from a ridge now, but from the same ground. He wondered if they would follow him in, or if this was their line. In the end, they made the choice for him. The larger turned toward the ridge trail. The smaller lingered for 3 steps more, then went after her. David stood there until the last of their shapes blurred into the brighter fog on the slope. Only then did he turn back toward the cabin, the weight of the pack settling differently on his shoulders now, heavier in some ways, lighter in others. The fog was gone by midday. The valley lay open under a flat winter sun, its light thin but unbroken. The air felt different without the weight of the white, louder somehow, every branch creak and crow call carrying farther. David sat on the cabin's porch rail, the pack at his feet, the copper cylinder and telescope laid out beside him. The wood beneath his hands was still damp from the morning's breath, but already it was drying in the sunlight. He should have felt relief at the clarity. Instead, he found himself missing the shroud, the way it had held the world close, made each step matter. Out here in the open, the distances seemed wider, the silences less private. He went inside, set the cylinder and telescope on the table, and lit the stove for heat more than cooking. The kettle began its slow murmur as he checked the notebook again, turning to the pages where the hand had drawn the ridge, the wall, the black square. Now he could put his own eyes to those places. But there was no note in the book to say what came next. The chain was whole, and whole chains were meant to stay that way. He was halfway through boiling water for tea when he noticed it, a sound he'd grown used to, missing now. No movement outside. No slow, deliberate shift of paws on snow. The bears were gone. It wasn't unusual, they had disappeared before, sometimes for days. But this time, something in the rhythm was different. They hadn't left in the fog's cover. They'd gone in the open, choosing to be seen and then not seen again. He stepped outside, scanning the ridgeline. Nothing. Only the shadowed treeline, the gullies etched deeper by the sun's low angle. He walked the clearing's edge, then the start of the ridge trail. Tracks crossed the snow here, 2 sets, both fresh from that morning's descent. They ran together for 20 yards before splitting. The larger's path angled up toward the ridge proper. The smaller's cut a shallower course, skirting the slope. David followed the smaller's trail, the snow crisp and fine in the sun. It wound through stands of young birch, then dipped into a hollow where the snow lay deeper. Halfway across the hollow, the prince stopped. He crouched, brushing at the snow with his glove. The ground here wasn't open, it was the roof of something, a buried beam just visible under a crust of ice. He cleared more and found the outline of a hatch, iron hinges, wood swollen with frost. A narrow iron ring sat flush with the planks. The hatch was small, no bigger than a crawl space, and hidden well enough that a week of snow could have erased it. But the smaller bear had stopped here on purpose, paws pressing the snow down flat as if marking it. David looked back the way he'd come. From the hollow's far edge, the hatch would be invisible. From the ridge, it would be invisible. Only from here, in the path the bear had taken, did it appear. He dug out the ice from the ring with his knife point. It lifted with a dry groan. The hatch opened to darkness, a breath of air colder than the snow touching his face. He set the lantern on the edge, lit it, and lowered it in. The space below was a short shaft, then a narrow tunnel braced with cedar beams. The floor was packed earth. The tunnel angled downward, curving toward where the river would run or the wall would stand. He thought of the notebook's first page, the one that said to leave a thread. This could be the thread, a way between places that never broke the surface, safe from sight, from weather, from anything but deliberate hands. He lowered himself into the shaft, boots touching down on firm earth. The air smelled of stone, water, and the faintest echo of lamp oil. The tunnel was just wide enough to walk if he turned sideways in places. The lantern's light caught tool marks on the beams, some fresh enough to still have sharp edges. Someone had worked here within the last few seasons. After 30 yards, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. On one wall hung a frame of pegs, each holding a coil of rope, a canvas tarp, or a hook. On the floor sat a wooden crate half-filled with wax-sealed jars labeled in that same hand, candle grease, tea, dried salt. Beside it leaned a folded piece of sailcloth with a twin oval mark inked in one corner. Another passage left the chamber, angled sharply down. He followed, the air growing colder, the sound of water building until he could hear its physical shape, the roll of current against stone, the break of wave against something solid. The tunnel ended at a grated opening in the cliff face. Through it, the river showed in a slice of slate and white, the fog now fully burned away from its skin. He traced the tunnel back to the hatch, climbed out, and closed it carefully. Snow drifted over the seam as he stepped away, the marks of his gloves already softening. The smaller bear's tracks led away from the hollow, meeting the larger's again at the ridge trail. From there, both sets angled toward the far slope, the one that faced the valley beyond. He followed until the ground steepened, then stopped. The sun was lowering now, the sky going that pale brass color before the first blue of evening. The ridge's edge caught the light and turned it into a line of fire across the snow. Farther up, two shapes stood side by side. The larger turned her head, the smaller facing forward. For a moment, David thought they might come down again. Instead, they stood there until the light shifted, and then they turned, walking along the ridge until the trees swallowed them whole. David stood in the snow, watching the empty ridgeline, until the cold began to push through his boots. Then he turned toward the cabin. The pack felt heavier again, but it was the kind of weight you carried on purpose. Inside, he set the cylinder on the table, next to the telescope and the notebook. Outside, the valley lay open and clear, the fog's curtain pulled back, for now. But he knew it would return. And when it did, he'd be ready.